abortion. This word brings up a whole lot of what we call big feelings at my house. Immediately you may hear that word and think evil, hates babies, murder, bad, 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 bad. And if so, you are likely on the pro-life side of the bank. Or you may hear that word and you live on the pro-choice side of the river. You may hear abortion and think, my body, my choice, rageful defiance at the idea of Roe versus Wade being overturned, and feel that your reproductive rights are actively being trampled on. And for some of you, hearing this word might make you feel like, oh my gosh, not this again. And you prefer to avoid the polarizing sides. So you live in the gray zone middle river, floating back and forth on your little boat between the two ideas, but not really landing anywhere and not taking anybody with you. In my life, I have lived on both sides of the river. I grew up and spent many, many years deeply rooted on the pro-life side, but I have currently set up camp in the pro-choice side after having made a very, and I mean very slow and winding river passage through the unsure waters that are the gray area in between. And I've noticed something. These two sides of the river, they both have a common goal. They both want to build a bridge to the other side and have healthier, happy populations and for everyone to be their best self, right? But they cannot agree on how to build that bridge. One wants to ban almost all abortions, and the other wants to protect access to it. And since their blueprints and talking points for making this bridge are completely different, nothing happens. Except we stand on the banks and scream, why are you doing this wrong? What is wrong with you people? Becoming angrier and angrier at the individuals on the other side, on the other riverbank. Which is a problem because we tend to demonize people we don't understand. We label them as weird, misguided, ignorant, stupid, evil, and selfish. And since we usually consider what we are used to as the normal and right way, this differentiation from ourselves, no matter how small, naturally makes those other people other. They have horrible ideas about abortion, whereas mine are compassionate and well-reasoned. Their bridge building plans are ridiculous. They're horrible, whereas mine are brilliant. We are right and you are wrong because you are different. So we don't build bridges, we build walls, and we let the grass on the banks get really high so we don't even have to see the other side, and we further distance ourselves from the other side. But the problem right now is, as of a few weeks ago, we really need to build our bridge, okay? Because our two sides of the river, they might feel like different worlds, but we actually live in some of the same states. And since Roe versus Wade got overturned in the recent Dobbs Supreme Court decision, and the state now has to come up with a plan for how to proceed with abortion, well, we need to get together and we need to build our bridge. We have to get along enough to compromise and come up with a plan that works for most people. And buckling down into our echo chambers behind our walls, it's not the way. And we need to get to know the other side because compromise, it's just really not something you usually do with others. You usually do it with people who you understand and you respect as equals. So today, I am going to share my lived experience from both sides of the river and the messy gray area in between, and hopefully give you some humanizing insight into both sides so that we can see each other as humans first and others second, so that we can have a conversation and build our bridge. Okay? Great. Are you nervous? I am. Let's do this. Massive content warning before though. We will be talking about all things like that are really hard medically. So if this is not for you, please reroute to content that's more appropriate for you. We can do hard things, and sometimes those hard things are avoiding topics that we just really don't need at the moment. Hello, my friends. I am Liz. I am a family nurse practitioner who is now very, very pro-choice. So before you tell me in the rest of this video that I am biased, yes, that is my bias, and you'll notice it throughout this video, I'm sure. But my goal isn't to convince you one way or another here, I promise. It's just to build some understanding and introduce you to things and ideas and perspectives that maybe you hadn't considered before. So I hope, even though we may not agree already, that you can still listen. So I grew up in a conservative Christian household. We were super involved in our church. I had a great family. We had a very middle class, lovely life. And I did not know that I lived in a beautiful bubble. And I know this is just my experience also, so no need to leave comments saying, my experience wasn't yours, you're way off here, because we all have totally different experiences. That's actually the point of today. And maybe you can relate to mine, maybe you can relate to others, but either way, if you could listen and just try to understand, that would be awesome. Anyway, onward. My introduction to the topic of abortion was in junior high. Because remember, I lived in a really sheltered bubble where like things like this, they just weren't really like discussed. I went to a private Christian school and sex ed was like not on the table at all. We literally would have group discussions on the playground in 6th grade about what a period was because none of us had any idea. And we were all too scared to like ask an adult. And we came to the conclusion that after you had developed a certain amount of pubic hair, your bladder filled up with blood and you peed out. You got cranky. And that, my friends, was your period. And before you judge me, I need you to remember that this was before the internet, okay? These things were not just look upable. And that is my only defense for that explanation. Anyways, in junior high, someone asked about it in a class, which led to my first introduction to the topic. And I remember it because it was awful. So trigger warning to people who don't want to hear about this type of stuff. We were told that abortion is murder, always, full stop. And it involved taking the equivalent of those like really long yard work shears up into the uterus and chopping things up to end that pregnancy. We didn't even know what a uterus really was, or at least I didn't. And I remember that after that description, there was like literally zero follow-up. They just said, that's what that is. And we just continued with the lecture that I'm sure nobody listened to because we were like, excuse me, like what? And just stunned. And that was honestly the start of the abortion is evil narrative that I had in my head for many, many years. My church, my youth group, my church small group, many friends, and all the respected adults around me pretty much all held the same beliefs around abortion that were repeated over and over and over again throughout my teenage and young adult years. And that completely shaped how I viewed the topic. And since they were my people, I held really tightly to these ideas and I didn't question them. I was very protective of them because this was my reality. My trusted community passionately believed that abortion is murder. So I did too, but it went way past that, honestly. If you didn't grow up in this environment, I just wanted to give you some examples of some things that were taught to us during this phase when we were deciding how we felt about the world, about abortion, to help you conceptualize why so many people may think so passionately and so differently than you. It might be because the only thing that they have learned about abortion, or most of the things they've learned about abortion, were things like this. So first, abortion was always presented as murder. I can still picture slideshows from youth group that started with that statement, with pictures of piles of babies covered in blood, full-term babies usually, because we were also taught that people could and often did have abortions just because they wanted one right up until like the due date. It was a lot. There was a lot of discussion of pain that was involved, and it was brutal. There was no nuance. Abortion was murder. If you got nothing else out of those conversations, they wanted you to understand that. And many, many of us did. But what about the cases of violence, like R or even R by a family member? Also, we're going to be using YouTube safe words so that they let this video hopefully maybe stay up. Not because I don't think we can't handle the real deal, just FYI. I was taught that R and R by a close family member was very sad, and that was emphasized. It was very, very sad. But ending a pregnancy was not the answer because this was an opportunity for something beautiful to come out of something that was so evil. The child in this case, the baby, was a blessing and not a punishment for a crime that they did not commit. Was it fair? No. But the world was not fair because it was a sinful place. Would it be painful? Yes, because pregnancy and childbirth were a punishment or the pain of it was a punishment because Eve ate the apple in the Garden of Eden, and thus all women were punished with painful pregnancies and childbirth. And while that isn't the person's fault here, since it was not a consensual situation, pain is, once again, part of a sinful world. But the baby is a gift, and certainly not a punishment. The baby is a reward and a gift that you likely didn't even know you needed. And while we're all on the topic, all babies are gifts. Pregnancy termination after receiving news that the child would have a medical condition, those were evil, those were not allowed. All children were created perfectly by God and should have the opportunity to live. If they passed shortly after birth, that must have been the plan all along. We didn't need to understand it. We just needed to trust that there was a plan beyond our ability to understand, and we were told that people who terminated when they discovered a genetic abnormality were pretty much even worse than the willy-nilly murderers who had them. because they were selfish, because these people didn't just like the child that had been selected for them. And you should always have the baby that was selected for you and that you were given. And eventually someone would say, but what if they can't take care of the baby? Then there's adoption. The individual speaking about the topic in church or whatever setting we were in would usually ask if anybody ever knew anybody who had wanted to adopt a baby. And hands would like fly up, right? So many people wanted babies. There were so many hands in the air. Adoption was revered as a beautiful and restorative thing that saved babies from growing up in an unsafe home without enough money, attention, or without a mom and a dad, without a stable environment. So even if the individual doesn't want to keep the baby, they can put it up for adoption and it will be adopted so quickly and loved so much. But what about the women's right to choose? Well, women also had the right to choose to do the baby making activity, and this was a consequence of that action. It was generally understood by all of us that baby making activities outside of marriage were not okay. This was a really already established core belief that is introduced at a super young age in many churches, at least in Christianity. And a phrase I heard constantly growing up was, if you're ready for sex, you're ready to have a baby. Abstinence-only education was what was taught and revered as the choice for good people. And this concept was reinforced with like many sermons on if you have sex before you're married, you are disrespecting your future partner who they might have waited to have sex. You are showing up to your wedding like a piece of chewed gum or crumpled dirty paper. You're already used up. And would you rather be a fresh stick of gum or a chewed up piece of gum with hair in it, ladies? Obviously, none of us were like, oh, I want to be the gross gum person. So we had very established thoughts on all of this. So it was not a huge stretch for us to think, you're right. That is what you deserve. If you want to do like such a dirty, yucky thing outside of marriage where baby making belongs and where babies are always welcome. I was also taught that abortion is dangerous and would likely make it so that you could never have children in the future if you did that. And we were reminded about how awful that would feel to having to disclose that to our future husbands. Not only were we chewed gum at this point since we weren't pure, but we wouldn't be able to give him children. And I was taught that to deny abortions was actually the promotion of health of the woman because it preserved her fertility, saved her from painful and potentially dangerous medical procedures, and kept her from regretting that choice in the future. And to reinforce this, they would bring in lots of, video clips of tearful stories of people saying, oh, I got an abortion and then I regretted it. And, just like adults make rules out of love for their children to keep them safe, banning abortion was actually an act of love from their potential harmful, selfish actions of termination. But what if the mother's life was at risk? If it was an ectopic pregnancy, then the pregnancy could end because the pregnancy was not viable. But this was not an abortion, I was taught. It was a medical ending to a pregnancy. I was taught that it was medically classified different than abortion. That was always barbaric. In terms of other risks to the mother's life, this was so rare that we really didn't even need to make much time for it. This was an argument for abortion that abortion supporters threw around trying to guilt us into changing our minds. And it is so rare that it just doesn't even really need to be considered or talked about. It's an extremist talking point, basically. In the rare, and I mean rare event that mothers' lives were truly threatened by a pregnancy, then they could pray about it and decide what to do going forward. And if the risk to life was due to a mental health concern, then they could receive mental health treatment for their mental health problem. But ending the pregnancy would cause them more damage in the long run because then they would have mental illness and as well as being a murderer. And that would be a really huge mental toll and lots of anguish over the loss of the baby. And that's too much to handle emotionally. So you would certainly never have an abortion in the case of an emotional or mental health concern because it would just make it worse. Now, inevitably amongst all of this, someone always mentioned that this really wasn't fair because the boys didn't have to deal with this, and we had a whole Bible study at small group about this because this was a hot topic, and because small group was like just a girls thing. And in it, we talked about how lucky we are that we are girls because we get to experience the magic of motherhood, something the boys would never experience. So the fact that it was only us having to experience was actually like a really good thing because they would be deprived of the ability to grow and nurture a life like we would. So don't be jealous. They can't get pregnant. Feel bad for them because they can't get pregnant. Because being a mother when you are married is the best thing ever. Doing baby-making activities when you are not married and wanting to end that pregnancy makes you a selfish, irresponsible murderer who is willing to destroy their life and the life of others to get short-term relief of a long-term problem. We never discussed having abortions when you are married, because that didn't fit with the whole narrative we had going on. And let me tell you, it was effective. I had an intensely impressive, I am holier than thou complex going on, and it was in full effect as I entered my public high school and started to meet real life humans who were doing baby making things and had abortions. Granted, I was still not sure exactly how the baby making worked, but I felt very prepped to tell people how to never have an abortion or they were going to hell. And let me just tell you, that was not an awesome way to make friends, just in case you were wondering. And I know this is a serious video, but can we please just take a moment, please, to all agree that we need better education surrounding the topic of sex going forward, okay? Sex education is incredibly important, even if you don't want to have it until you're married. Can we agree on that? Okay, I hope. Maybe it's a good start. Maybe we can start there. Anyway, so I am going into public high school and a few evil people are out there having abortions, but they are bad and they are sinners. They are other. And then at small groups, surrounded by my church people, someone came in one day sobbing. She was 14. She was pregnant. She was not other. She was someone that I had known as long as I could remember. She was good. She was kind. She was a child. She had no idea how birth control worked because she had had the exact same education on the topic that I had, and probably had also mystical ideas about how periods happen. And she had been taking her friend's birth control on the days that she had sex, but only on that day, which is not how birth control works. And if you need education on birth control, I will leave some videos on that linked down below and some great resources. But this girl, she was terrified. And through her tears, she explained that she couldn't tell her parents. She did not know what to do because her dad had told her that if she came home with tattoos or a pregnancy, not to bother even coming home because it was her home no longer. And that is a really rough thing for a 14-year-old to grapple with. Eventually, her mother was told, she told her mom. Her mom, fearing the exact same outcome that the daughter feared, actually took her to get the abortion. They did not tell her dad. And it was explained to the group that she was a special case, right? She had her whole life ahead of her. This wasn't supposed to happen to her. She was very sorry. She needed to have a home to go to. This would break up the family. She asked for, she had asked for forgiveness, and this was just, it was different. And maybe you know of a case that was just different too, but maybe not, because a lot of people don't talk about it. She was not the first exception to the rule that I would learn about. But she was the most memorable because it was the first time I realized there was a slight nuance to this whole conversation. Exceptions did exist per the people who taught me the rules, that there were no exceptions. However, the messaging surrounding teaching it never changed. It was still taught as abortion is always murder. But I was now kind of keeping track of exceptions in my head. And each time I found one, it made me just look across the river and take a tiny step towards that gray, messy middle. My next personal major exception was in college. She was an incredibly good friend of mine from our church group on campus. Her boyfriend did not tell her that the condom broke because he worried it would make her nervous. Neither of them had any idea what Plan B was. And I have a whole video on that as well. If you were also in that camp, no shame, it's not well taught. You can watch it below. So he had no idea that there was something that could have possibly prevented the pregnancy that then ensued. She wasn't being irresponsible. She was trying to prevent pregnancy. She didn't have all the information. In my mindset at the time, I didn't love that she was doing it in general, but I was quickly learning that many people were chewed gum, as my youth pastor put it, and they really seemed to be doing okay. So I was slowly getting a little bit judgmental there too, but only a little bit. Honestly, a lot of my process of crossing this metaphorical river involved me becoming less judgmental. And I think in a society in general, we should all practice that. But anyway, this was a human I knew to be kind, well-meaning, gentle. She loved children. She was not ready to have them though. And this was also when I learned that medication abortions were a thing. which in my mind at the time seemed more okay if one were to get an abortion, to have it this way versus like the chopped up way. I looked it up and I found that 42% of abortions were performed before 9 weeks, and they were done with medication. And I wondered why this had never been discussed or portrayed when I learned about termination before. And over the next few years, as I met more and more people who were not selfish baby haters, who had had abortions, my preconceived notions were challenged, and I took a few tiny steps towards that river in the middle by thinking, okay, maybe if it's when the baby is so small and the abortion is via medication, then it's like not good. It's definitely not good, but could it be more forgivable? I went down the whole when is a person rabbit hole, and I had no answer, but like a 9-week fetus was maybe not a person yet. I was very unsure, but still, if you would ask me at that point, I would tell you abortion is always bad, but it is sometimes less evil. My next steps into the river were more confident. I was in a labor and delivery clinical in nursing school, and the nurse I was shadowing got frantically called into a room, and I followed very naively thinking I could somehow help with this emergency with my zero experience. And it turned out that the patient was 13. She was a victim of her stepfather. She was rushed to an emergency C-section because the baby was having trouble. She had a Hello Kitty pillowcase and a very, very loved stuffed rabbit that got tossed on the ground as they whisked her out of the room to the OR. Her lovey and her childhood bedroom mementos were there to help her feel comfort during this experience because she was a child, having a child. And it wasn't something beautiful coming from something horrible like I had always thought. It was awful. It was not fair. It was not humane. This pregnancy might have brought a new life into the world, but one look at that girl on that bed and you could see that a different life was absolutely being extinguished in its place. I had my first big step into the messy middle river that day. Abortion in cases of non-consensual baby making should absolutely be offered. And for many years, I followed that statement up with, but of course they should have just offered Plan B when they presented to report the incident, because I still believed that most people reported those type of events. But after years of working in the hospital and in primary care, I realized that people often don't report that type of thing, either because they are scared of the perpetrator, because they aren't ready to face the situation yet, or because they're unaware or don't have those resources to do so. In order to prevent pregnancy, Plan B also needs to be taken within a certain number of days of the encounter, and it doesn't always work. Plan B, I learned, is not the solution to pregnancies from violence. It is a solution if it works in the time frame and it's reported and it's available, but it's not the solution. Shortly after I started my job as a med-surg nurse, my views on abortion were challenged yet again. I had a patient who was dying of an accidental Tylenol overdose. She was having horrible headaches in her second trimester, which is very, very common. And her healthcare provider had told her, hey, you can take Tylenol. But they did not specify how much Tylenol, and she couldn't get rid of the headache, so she just kept taking more and more. And she took so much that now her liver was failing. She was 19 weeks pregnant, and every day I watched her get sicker and sicker. She was dying, and her body couldn't fight like this off and keep her alive and the other human she was growing alive. So she was given options to remain pregnant and you both probably die, or terminate the not yet viable pregnancy, and we can try to save you. She had 3 children at home and ultimately terminated the pregnancy so that she could have a chance of going home to them. It took 4 months and a liver transplant, but she did eventually go home to them. And there were so many others like her. So pregnant people dying while their bodies tried to keep 2 people alive, I learned was not so rare it shouldn't be considered as I had thought. This happens. And by limiting abortions, it puts providers in a really murky area of how much risk is enough risk to the pregnant person that this termination is now legally okay. I once took care of a teenager with severe congenital heart disease, meaning that the heart disease was something that she was born with. The plumbing is messed up in her heart. I took care of her as she died. Certain heart patients are counseled to never get pregnant because their heart can barely handle being the plumbing for 1 human, let alone 2, and pregnancy really increases the stress on your heart. But she did not receive sex ed. She ended up pregnant and she died. She came from a very pro-life area with only a handful of abortion providers in the whole state, and none of them were willing to perform a termination on someone with a severe heart condition, so they just waited. She did not tell her parents about the pregnancy initially because she was scared of their reaction, but eventually she was so symptomatic from her worsening heart condition that she had to. She could not hide this anymore. She was kicked out of her house, and it took several more weeks for her to get to us because the hospital that she was admitted to wouldn't do the termination because she wasn't sick enough. She was 21 weeks pregnant when her mom re-entered the picture and decided that she was tired of watching her child die in this hospital. So she advocated for a transfer. She was life flighted into our hospital, had an abortion performed, and she died of heart failure a week later. She died from a literal broken heart. I was taught that a figurative broken heart was what would kill you with the abortion due to the emotional toll of that action. But that child, the woman with a Tylenol overdose and dozens of other patients over the years who needed a termination to save their lives from physical ailments or mental health ailments, taught me otherwise. So I added a few steps into the abortion is gray river, right? I took those. I realized that limiting abortion harms pregnant people who need access to abortions to save their lives. Having to make a choice, are they dying enough, is arbitrary and will lead to more people dying because they're fearful that they'll make a call that will land them in jail. Will the jury agree that this person was about to die? I know this occurs because I saw it. I know this occurs because as a healthcare provider, I would fear that same liability. So at this point, I have rationalized to myself that overall, abortion is still bad. But I have racked up a good number of exceptions that make it acceptable in my mind. One of the huge things that I still could not wrap my mind around was late-term abortions defined as pregnancy termination at 21 weeks or later, because the images of chopped up babies were still incredibly strong in my mind. And then I met a patient who got one. She was 21 weeks pregnant at her routine anatomy scan for a very, very wanted baby. At that anatomy scan, they found that the baby had not developed the organs required for life. The baby would die at birth because it would not be able to breathe. She and her partner were given options. They could terminate the pregnancy, which would be considered a late-term abortion at this point, or they could proceed with the pregnancy and wait for labor to happen naturally, and they could deliver the child and it would pass at birth. She, like many people in this situation, worried what would be experienced by the baby at birth if it couldn't breathe. Would it suffer? But how do you, on the flip side, end a pregnancy that you wanted so much? To make this horrible decision even harder, she only had 1 week to decide because due to state laws, she couldn't have an abortion after 24 weeks. And it took 2 weeks to get on the schedule to have one. So she had to make that decision quickly. And they chose to terminate. They chose to terminate so that baby would never suffer. And statistics show that most of parents in this awful situation where the child will be born with a fatal anomaly usually choose to terminate to avoid any potential suffering as well. Late-term abortions, which are terminations at 21 weeks or later, are 1% of abortions. And there isn't excellent data on how many of those are related to fatal fetal anomaly, but I would be willing to bet that it's most of them. Limiting abortions takes that choice away from parents who are doing everything they can to protect the child that either way they will not get to take home. And if you have ever worked in pediatrics, you have likely taken care of children who were born with profound complications. They do not interact with the world and they require around-the-clock care. They require around-the-clock care and spend most of their very few days on this earth in the hospital. I have seen what that does to families. We can keep people alive for a really long time now, but alive and living, I am telling you, are not the same. And choosing not to have your child experience that, it's not murder, it is love. Choosing to have that child is also not bad. I am in no way saying that you should always terminate them. Neither of them are bad, but the fact that there is a choice there is so crucial. And the choice about these late-term abortions are not made willy-nilly and out of selfishness like I had always been taught. It took me a really long time to let go of the narrative that you can just waltz in and get an abortion when you are a month away from having a baby. Because remember, I was raised on those pictures during key moments in my development. This whole thing, the fear of the late-term abortion, was a defining feature of the narrative I was taught. So please hear me when I say I get that you may have been told that, and I get that you might believe it too, because I did too. But late-term abortions are not done on viable fetuses who can live outside the womb on their own. I was told that they were. You may have been told the same thing, but it is not true. There are no examples of abortions legally happening on fetuses after 24 weeks that don't have a fatal diagnosis through actual medical centers or a severe risk to the parent. Abortions are not being performed on viable fetuses. It is just called birth. And those little humans who can survive outside of the womb can be adopted if raising a child isn't in the pregnant person's life plan at the moment, right? Well, as it turns out, that is also not quite as uncomplicated as I had once believed either. In my beautiful bubble I was raised in, babies got rescued from awful situations to be raised by wonderful, loving families, and everyone lived happily ever after. But what I came to learn by learning more about adoption, by talking to people who had had their children adopted, meeting more adopted people, and more people in the foster care system, I learned that adoption isn't the answer to everything like I thought. One, because I learned adoption in itself is trauma. It's a separation from your birth parents, and it's not all butterflies and rainbows like I thought. And two, because not all children get adopted. There is a narrative out there that I was fed and very much believed that there are immense waiting lists out there for parents waiting for babies to adopt. So of course abortion shouldn't happen because people want all of those babies. But what they don't tell you is that those people want a certain type of baby, a healthy baby, a full-term baby, a baby who has had prenatal care, who isn't born addicted to anything, who won't have disabilities that make life harder because they were born super early, who hasn't been exposed to alcohol for an entire pregnancy, who doesn't have a chronic or genetic diagnosis. Most people want to adopt a baby that was essentially given like the surrogacy treatment, right? A baby who was grown by a compliant pregnant person. And I'm telling you, I have rocked and snuggled and held so many babies who never got adopted. I have, for hours, tried to calm them as they withdrew from heroin as a newborn and saw them as they came back in, as they grew and had their heart condition. And each time they were with a new caseworker or a different foster parent, but no one would adopt them due to the behavioral and medical problems they had listed in their chart. This wasn't once. This happened all the time, and I realized that forcing someone to be pregnant doesn't force them to take care of the pregnancy. Forcing someone to deliver a baby with severe chronic diagnoses doesn't make those diagnoses just go away. And even though I was pro-life and I wanted that child to have a chance at life, what kind of life was I really advocating for? Of the nearly 450,000 children in the US in the foster care system, 100,000 are waiting to be adopted. 100,000. If you want to adopt, go adopt. There are 100,000 people who would love the chance to join your family. And at that point I thought, okay, if I want to argue adoption is the answer, I have to at least wait until we get that number of adoptable children down. We don't have a lack of children waiting to be adopted. We have a lack of parents willing to adopt humans who enter the foster care system. So where was I at kind of now? Let's just do a quick check-in. I still very much believed abortion was overarchingly a bad thing because when you are raised thinking something, remember, as a core belief, it is really freaking hard to change that. But I was in the middle of the river of uncertainty because I had a lot of exceptions. There were a lot of really good and valid reasons I saw that people got an abortion, and that list was growing constantly. I could not no longer say that abortion is always murder, these people are evil. But I held so tightly to the idea that if you didn't have a good reason, like you just didn't want to have a baby or something right now, then you were irresponsible and you should not just go have an abortion willy-nilly. And that feeling kept me in the river, pulling me back and forwards, kind of like an anchor to that past belief for a really long time. And possibly the most ironic thing of all, the thing that got me off of that anchor, that got me firmly to the other side, standing in the pro-choice side of things, I got pregnant and my life changed. And not in like the, oh my gosh, I'm going to be a parent way, in like the, I threw up at a minimum of 10 times a day, every single day for 29 weeks. I had pubic symphysis dysfunction and felt like I was being torn in half all the time. I developed horrible depression. And for me, being pregnant was hell on earth. for 10 months. And like pretty much everyone else, I had to keep working during all of this. Fortunately, I worked in the middle of the night in a hospital. So there were lots of trash cans and I could literally just be nauseous all the time, lean over, puke into a trash can and keep going. And the thing that kept me going through all of this was I wanted this baby. So I had that light at the end of the tunnel to keep doing all of the things I was supposed to do. Avoid the certain foods and activities. Don't take any of the medicine that would actually help make this more tolerable, but it's not good for the baby. Move my miserable body because that's what's best for baby. Do all the things. Being pregnant is a lot of work. It takes a huge toll on you. And then you have to have the baby and your body is destroyed. And then recovery doesn't even exist in this country. And you are supposed to show back up to work and like live your normal life again within 6 weeks as if this last year just didn't happen. And you're not like leaking bodily fluids out of all sorts of new and ripped and bloody and torn holes in your body. We'll just pretend like that doesn't happen. It's fine. You can just go back to normal. The baby making thing it's rough. Are all pregnancies miserable? No. Some unicorn humans like have a great time and they love it. But all pregnancies do require you to give up your body for a really long time. All pregnancies change your body. All pregnancies increase your risk of dying in the pre-birth and post-birth period because pregnancy itself is a risk factor for literally like every medical condition since your body now has to try to keep 2 people alive. Not to mention that pregnancy requires many people to stop medications that is keeping them healthy and functioning because that medicine might not be safe for a growing human. Pregnancy also has a huge association with domestic violence. Many people get an abortion because they are afraid of their partner or their partner told them that they had to. And if they can't terminate the pregnancy, there is a large risk that those pregnant people may be terminated themselves. That is not an exaggeration. That is statistics. That is life in many people's bubble. And all of that is not something that should be forced on someone. After myself becoming pregnant, I knew deep down that people should not be forced to give up their body for another person who can't live without them. Because pregnancy, giving birth, and postpartum is life-changing and has forever effects. And with that realization, everything got super clear and I stepped out on the other side of the bank and found that I was, after 17 years, pro-choice. And it wasn't about the fetus. And it wasn't about when did the fetus have a heartbeat or when the pregnant person was sick enough or when does a fetus feel pain or when is a person. None of those impossible to answer questions that had plagued me for so long mattered because it all came down to one thing for me. Can this fetus survive without the pregnant person's organs? If yes, you should be able to end that pregnancy and let the baby do its thing. It can live outside on its own. And if no, although that fetus has the potential for life, it requires the use of another person's body, and that is never okay without that person's consent, period. You get to choose if you want to endure a pregnancy because it's your body and your choice. No need for a laundry list of exceptions to be written into a law. Abortion is not okay unless X, Y, or Z. To me, it became clear that it makes a lot more sense to allow autonomy over one's body. And if you don't want abortions to happen, do everything in your power to prevent unwanted pregnancies in the first place through things like comprehensive sex ed, easy access to contraception, and education on how to actually use it. Getting rid of abstinence-only education that has been shown to increase rates of unwanted pregnancy time and time again in studies. And if you want people to have a chance at life, let's improve social structures so that they address the millions of already living children in this country who are not getting a great chance at life because they are living in extreme poverty, they don't have food, and they're not being given the tools or the support to break this cycle that they were born into. There is so much good that we can do with the rage that you feel at abortion. So much could change if that energy was pointed towards making life better for the people who are currently here. So friends, please consider both sides for me. If you are passionately pro-choice and you can't even begin to understand where pro-life people are coming from, I hope that this helped you see how powerful beliefs can be when they are held from a really young age and echoed to you throughout your entire community. And that this gives you a little bit more compassion when having conversations with people you don't agree with. And if you are pro-choice, I hope this gave you something to think about. Maybe it exposed you to things outside of your day-to-day worldview and helps you see someone like me as a person and not an evil baby hater. And maybe consider that people who do get abortions are not doing so because they are reckless and selfish murderers. They are making the choice that is best for their body and their family. And when you vote, consider the examples that I gave in this video, because your vote on this matters. It affects all the people and children in your community, particularly those living in poverty or those with more melanated skin. Well, it's easy to say like, oh, I'll vote against abortion, and if you want to go to a different state to get it, you are missing the fact that most people can't afford to just pick up, go in their car, get in it, and drive to a different state. These laws disproportionately affect low-income and BIPOC people because they have less access to preventative care and birth control due to known systemic issues of lack of resources and racism within the healthcare system. Low-income people are 5 times as likely to experience an unplanned pregnancy due to these barriers when compared with those above the poverty line, even though the sexual activity levels between the groups are exactly the same. An unplanned pregnancy doesn't just affect the parent and the child. Unplanned pregnancy has significant implications for that entire family's future, regardless of whether the child was adopted in the end or not. That family who keeps the baby is more likely, if they have an unplanned pregnancy, to experience poverty, less family stability, worse outcomes for children, and domestic violence, whether or not those children are adopted. I drive that point home because adoption is not the answer. Again, it is an answer, but it is not the golden answer here. Neither is making abortion illegal. Why? Because when abortion laws are put in place in states, the number of abortions in low-income populations does drop. But you know what doesn't? The number of abortions for those who have enough money to leave and go get one. Because there are so many exceptions. So many people like the ones in my youth group or college who are good people who just got a little bit mixed up and are having their situation handled. Those people will still have access, and people will die, just like my patient did, because abortion laws will require judgment calls of when is the mother's life at risk? Does mental health crisis count? What if they say they are going to opt out of life itself if they remain pregnant? Is that a crisis enough? Is that a risk to the parent? Where is that line? A law built to have exceptions is not clear and is dangerous. I discussed that all in a video if you want to learn more about like why, and you can see what you can do to affect change, and you can go and click it. I'll leave it in the link down below. You can watch it after this. But I just want to say thank you genuinely for listening to all of this if you got this far. This took me a million years to film because I didn't want to come off as confrontational, but I do have really huge feelings about this, and it might have come off confrontational at the end. And if it did, I just hope you know that wasn't my intent. This video is kind of what I wish I had seen when I was 16 to let me know that there is a more to the world than my beautiful bubble. And I wish it hadn't taken me 33 years to get to a place where I was less judgmental and a little bit more proactive and preventative versus reactive, and just generally supportive of people who are overall really just trying to do the best that they can with what they have available to them. Please, my dear people, keep the comments respectful. I am always happy to host conversations and disagreements on here. You don't have to have my opinion, but I will be deleting flat out hate. I hope this helped give you a view of the other side a little bit more, made you think of people more as human, and gave you something to take with you into the next conversation you have on this topic. Thank you again so much for listening, and I do very much hope that you know that you, my friend, are not alone. You are more than enough just as you are, and you can do hard things, like having these conversations with people, especially when they don't agree with you. Until next time, friends.